over the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, Institute staff members have fanned out throughout the Middle East, from Rabat to Dubai. And we've had people traveling to all corners of this region in order to return prior to President Obama's visit to the Middle East and inject some on-the-ground observations and insight into the deliberations inside Washington in the early weeks of this administration and as the administration prepares for the president's visit. In some places, I think our scholars advanced Secretary Kerry's trip and certainly met with many of the people that that he has met with in the course of his travels. And today, I've invited 3 of our scholars who were throughout North Africa to offer their observations and impressions. And then on Thursday, we reconvened to focus on Syria and its regional repercussions and the impact that the regionals are having on the Syria issue. So if you haven't already RSVP'd for the Thursday event, please do so. Today, as I said, we're focusing on North Africa. And here, the issues really are quite complex and different, depending on where you stand in North Africa. Egypt, economic, political turmoil, security in the Sinai, security in Port Said, and the inability of the government to provide for basic security for its people. You move further west, and the issues change. We're going to hear from Aaron, who was in Tunisia, where there is profound political uncertainty right now, amid the rise of an influential Salafist movement as well. David didn't get a chance to go to Algeria on this trip, although that was one of the original stops in his itinerary. But there, of course, you now have this insurgent terrorism and the blowback from what's going on in Mali. And then as you go further west in Morocco, where we've had a very quiet Arab Spring, as it were, there's some very important, almost subterranean political developments there that we'll hear from. So we're going to go across North Africa today. We're going to start with Eric Traeger, who I think by acclamation has emerged as really the most insightful observer of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, in Washington today, and his contributions in helping Washington understand what the Muslim Brotherhood is all about and the political challenge we face from the Muslim Brotherhood-led government in Egypt, I think has been very significant and very proud of Eric's contribution to that. Eric will speak first about Egypt, then Aaron Zellen, our Richard Burrow Fellow, who, as I said a moment ago, spent time in Tunisia, is going to talk about the political situation there in the wake of the assassination of Shukri Balid. And then Dave Pollock, who was in Morocco and Egypt prior to that, is going to offer his perspective on, especially in the Moroccan angle on all this. And then we'll open this up for discussion and debate. So first, Eric. You're going to be using the screen, so I'll move over here for a few minutes. Okay.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and it's definitely good to be back. I was in Egypt for a week, really a full week of work on the ground. I want to kind of describe the trip. So I went into this trip feeling as though the real story was not happening in Cairo. I mean, you've been reading about the clashes and the protests in Mansoura, in Port Said, the civil disobedience, and there have been reports of just attacks all over the country, particularly in the Delta and in the Suez Canal area. So, of course, I started in Cairo, but I then went to Alexandria, where I spent a couple of days. I went to Kafr el-Sheikh, which is a Delta governorate. The governor there is a Muslim brother. He's one of the two four Muslim brother governors, but this guy was previously a guidance office member, so a very high-ranking Muslim brother. And then I went to Suez and then back to Cairo. Now, in each of these stops, I was not only meeting with national leaders from the various parties that matter, and I'll discuss those, but I was also really looking at the local level, the governorate level, and trying to figure out how people are preparing, how different parties are preparing for elections, the extent of the upheaval, and also the motivations for the boycott of the non-Islamists, for how the Muslim Brotherhood will organize, what's happening regarding splits within the Salafist bloc. So that's really what I'm going to be presenting today. Here's the short version of what I found. First of all, and I think this is a very important thing to focus on, the Muslim Brotherhood has power, but it has no control. And here I actually have to kind of correct myself, because I've been under the assumption for a while that, yes, the Brotherhood would win elections and that they're a totalitarian organization that would then seek to implement power. But the fact is the Brotherhood can't actually do it. They cannot, they simply do not know how to govern. They do not know how to work within a bureaucracy. They don't know how to manage a bureaucracy. And the more they've tried to enforce their rule, the greater the resistance has been. So they have power. They talk about legitimate power, the fact they won elections, but they really have very little control, even over the institutions that they technically control. Secondly, Salafist divisions are likely to affect electoral performance. The Salafists ran as a unified bloc in the 2011-2012 elections, but there has been a major split that might have ramifications for their performance. It remains to be seen. I'm going to explain what that is. Also, non-Islamists have been unable to capitalize on both a drop in the Brotherhood's popularity as well as on the splits within the Salafists because they're boycotting the elections. And as I'm going to discuss, this boycott is really something that's being pushed by grassroots activists and is something that political party leaders, non-Islamist party leaders, actually in private will say that they disagree with, but they're so weak, these party leaders, that they're unable to kind of enforce their will to proceed in elections against the Brotherhood on their rank and file. And the military is going to stand aside for as long as it can. You know, there's been this assumption that the military may move in, may reassert power. My sense is that the military, even though it's sending messages about not letting a single power control everything, the military has learned from the 16 months during which it controlled the country after Mubarak fell that it really can't govern. It doesn't know how. It's not trained for it. It's not comfortable policing streets. And I think it's going to wait until its narrow bureaucratic interests, specifically its perquisites, its economic interests, are threatened before it moves in. And finally, I think the situation in Egypt will be one of persistent civil strife, but not necessarily one that leads to a mass revolution, I think. And I emphasize I think because we should always be aware of the way certain events can trigger something much greater than what we're seeing right now. We should be aware that economic collapse could have ramifications that are not just muddle through, that lead to some kind of massive uprising. And we should also be kind of humble with the reality that very few people saw on January 24th, 2011, that the revolution would start the next day, myself included, and I was in Cairo at that point. So I'm inclined to think that this is going to be a very messy, unstable, weak state, but not really a new round of revolution. All right, let me get into the weeds here. The Muslim Brotherhood is less confident but expects victory. The Brotherhood, if you speak to them, does not look like the Brotherhood of 6 months ago, let alone a year ago. They do not feel anymore like the moment is theirs. You talk to them, they admit quite frankly that they've made mistakes, that they are having real difficulty dealing with the administration or administering the country, and they sense that they are losing popularity among the public. I don't think that they're simply positioning themselves. I think that they are actually very much in tune with the reality, but they expect to win. win because they don't see non-Islamists as a realistic challenge. And that's because they simply don't think that non-Islamists can touch people culturally in the way that Islamists can. And they're also aware of the splits within the Salafist bloc. So they kind of understand that they've made a lot of mistakes, but they don't expect to pay any price at the ballot box. They also frequently blame their failures on other forces. So, for example, I was interviewing Mohammed al-Beltaghi. He's a prominent leader in the Freedom and Justice Party, a well-known former parliamentarian. He was saying that there's, foreign money, domestic money from the old regime that's being used to fuel a lot of the violence. They're after us, So you get that a lot. This paranoia, this idea that there is a deep state that's after them. My own view is that there's a weak state. But the three institutions they frequently point to as working directly against the Brotherhood are the judiciary, the Interior Ministry, and the state media. And you've already seen Morsi try to undermine judicial independence because he sees the judiciary as an enemy. And the state media is something the Brotherhood moved very quickly to appoint new editors. I'm going to speak about what they're going to do about the Interior Ministry in a little bit. Also, it mistrusts the government bureaucracies that they now, in theory, control. So here I'm interviewing Osama Yassin. He's a Muslim brother. He was appointed Minister of Youth. He said, listen, I don't trust this bureaucracy. It's too difficult. I'm going to work directly with the people. And that's something we should be watching very closely because it opens this question of whether the Brotherhood is using its political power to channel resources not through state institutions but directly to its own interests. Also, action on the economy is not likely to come before elections. I was meeting on Saturday with a Brotherhood economist, and his view, and this is kind of their talking point, is we can't take tough measures such as cutting subsidies or raising taxes to deal with the cash crunch. We can't do these things without a parliament that will give us consensus moving forward. That's a talking point. What he's basically saying is, look, we're not going to make tough decisions before elections. It's something that anyone who studies politics can understand. The problem is that Egypt's cash crisis is so severe right now, and the pound is becoming so weak, and their ability to cover subsidies is very much in doubt, that they might not have the time. The parliamentary elections will end in late June. Parliament will sit for the first time July 6th. July 9th is Ramadan. And as we all know, Egypt shuts down for a month in Ramadan. So you're basically talking about not getting any real economic reforms through Parliament until August. Egypt might not have that time. And finally, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Freedom and Justice Party, its political arm, are becoming significantly intertwined, but in a different way. As many of you who have heard me before know, I pay a lot of attention to the Brotherhood structure. At the lowest level, and I'm sorry it doesn't show up on the slide here, is the family units. These are the cells that are scattered throughout the country. A number of those make up a populace. Then you have the area level, the governor level, then a number of governorates in a sector, and then here's this whole executive and legislative office that merely sends Brotherhood commands down a pyramid structure to local brothers who execute whatever it is. This is a very well-oiled Brotherhood structure. I could talk about it more in the Q&A. What I found on this trip interviewing local Muslim Brotherhood political leaders is that the Brotherhood has basically been replicating this very structure on the party level in a more simplified form. So the family and populace levels have now been consolidated into what's called a wahda, or a unit. The area is now called a merkaz, or a center. The governorate still corresponds with the governorates. And then you have the general secretariat and the executive committee. What's important to note here is that in many cases, Brotherhood officials, now I should say at each level of this Brotherhood structure, you have what's called an administrative office that deals with issues that the Brotherhood has to deal with on the governorate level, area level, and populace level. Leaders from those administrative offices are simply shifting over. So most importantly, at the governorate level in the Brotherhood, many Brotherhood governorate officials are now shifting over and becoming FJP governorate officials. What's important there is that the Brotherhood, I think, and this is something to watch for, but I did get some sense of this, is trying to use the party to some extent as part of its recruitment mechanisms, because these party headquarters are now major social centers where people hang out, where they discuss politics. And I asked a local Brotherhood leader, look, are you trying to use this to recruit members? And he answered in a very coy way. He said, well, it's not the goal, but if it happens, that's fantastic. So I think it's something to look out for. The important thing is that the Brotherhood is basically repackaging itself and its leaders under this new party. One thing that I did not get to the bottom to is who is now filling in these levels of leadership. What I would expect is that the Brotherhood is actually trying to now move younger members into the leaderships of these areas, because the Brotherhood has been trying to get younger. They felt that they were too much led by older people, but I don't know that for a fact. The important point, though, is that it is repackaging itself and its leaders as now party leaders. I also got to interview three of kind of the up-and-coming Muslim brothers. When I say young guns, these are not really young people, but these are, in other words, the kind of next generation of prospective Brotherhood leaders. One is Saad al-Husseini. The whole reason that I went to Kafr Sheikh was to interview Saad al-Husseini, who's a Muslim Brotherhood governor. Saad al-Husseini is an engineer. He was a young guidance office member. He became a member of the guidance office, I believe, in his late 40s. And being an engineer, he is close to Khayrat al-Shatter, the deputy supreme guide of the Muslim Brotherhood. And he is seen within the organization as a Khayrat al-Shatter man. And we know that Khayrat al-Shatter played an important role in his appointment, because when Morsi was appointing governors, the Egyptian president appoints the governors, he consulted directly with the guidance office, and it stands to reason, since he was appointed, that Shatter played a key role in Saad al-Husseini's appointment. The next leader, who's an up-and-coming leader, is Osama Yassin. He's the Minister of Youth. Here's what's interesting about Osama Yassin. When the revolution was happening in 2011, the Brotherhood was being directed in the square by Mohammed Morsi from the guidance office. This is the way the Brotherhood does demonstrations. You'll have someone in the guidance office communicating with somebody within the demonstration, who then disseminates messages to cadres in the demonstration, you know, whether it's doing things like keeping the area clean or fighting aggressors, or whatever. Within the revolution, Morsi was the guidance office official directing the action in the square. He told this to Time magazine. And Osama Yassin told me that he was the Brotherhood official in the square executing those orders. Well, fast forward 2 years, Morsi is now the president, and Osama Yassin is now the Minister of Youth. Previously, Osama Yassin was on the Cairo Administrative Office, where he oversaw the youth portfolio. The Cairo Brotherhood Administrative Office is typically seen as one of the feeders to the guidance office. So this is someone who was seen as a future guidance office member, but instead has been appointed the Minister of Youth. The last kind of up-and-coming Brotherhood leader you should be aware of, who I interviewed, is Mohammed al-Beltaghi. Now, Beltaghi was a key point of contact during the revolution between Brotherhood youths who wanted the Brotherhood to be more active in the revolution, and the guidance office that initially resisted more involvement in the revolution because they were afraid of a crackdown. So he was ultimately the one who convinced the guidance office, listen, this thing is happening, the revolution is happening, we have to join it. But he's fallen kind of on hard times within the organization. He was very critical of the SCAF at the moment that the Brotherhood was cooperating with the SCAF. So it was seen that he was kind of pushed out of the way. He's a doctor, he's a medical doctor, and it was expected that he would be the chairman of the health committee in the parliament, but he was ultimately passed over, and he's now just an executive member of the Freedom and Justice Party. So I asked him point blank, I said, listen, there are three top young Muslim brothers who are up and coming. Saad al-Husseini is a governor, Osama Yassin is a minister, and you're nothing. Why are you nothing? Why were you passed over? And he gave me a look, which is fair because it was a really rude question. And then he said to me, well, actually, I'm the one in charge of trying to reform the Interior Ministry. What does that mean? That means that he's going to try to make sure that the Interior Ministry is more open, which is code word for saying, and he sort of admitted this, that he's going to try to drop the restrictions on Muslim brothers entering the Interior Ministry. So actually, despite the fact that he has not been given a real governmental executive position, you should watch him because he's going to be the one who will be trying to restructure the Interior Ministry. Remember, the Brotherhood's three enemies, as they see it within the government, are the judiciary, state media, Interior Ministry. That's their Interior Ministry man. Okay, the Salafists. In the last elections, the Salafists ran under a single political bloc that was really headed by the Noor Party. The Noor Party is the political arm of Al-Dawa al-Salfiyah, a Salafist organization founded in the 1970s, headed by Yasser Burhami. Yasser Burhami was seen as dominating the party too aggressively, so certain leaders from the Noor Party left and formed the Watan Party. This is kind of where the conflict between the Salafists stands, and let me size up the conflict. The Noor Party is the arm of a national organization. That means it has better mobilizing potential than the Watan Party, which has no national organization backing it. This is not to say that the Noor Party is like the Brotherhood and that can move people in a very coherent way, but still, having a national organization will help you with mobilization. It also has its social services networks intact. Remember that, like the Brotherhood, the Salafists provide medical caravans, sell food at below market rates, and the Noor Party, through Adawa al-Salfiyah, is still doing that in impoverished communities, and will use that as a mobilizing tool during elections. Finally, it still has the most prominent Salafist politicians in most cases. I mean, some prominent Noor Party people defected to Watan, but for the most part, the most prominent Salafists are still Noor Party leaders. On the other hand, though, local sheikhs are increasingly supporting the Watan Party. This is what I'm hearing at the local level. Remember that Salafists are deeply divided among a whole bunch of movements and non-movements and sheikhs, and people will listen to their sheikhs. So even if you don't have a national organization, but you have local sheikhs that are backing your party, that could be good enough. On the other hand, the Watan Party does not have any social services, and this is why they are really worried that they might not perform well. I was actually interviewing their spokesman, Mohammed Noor, who was previously the spokesman of the Noor Party, and he actually, at the end of the interview, was very bizarre. He looks at me and he says, "Do you think we have a chance?" And I said, "I don't know." But it said to me that this wasn't a very confident guy, and I think lacking the social services was a big part of that. And the thing that might boost the Watan Party the most is that they may form a coalition with Hazem Abu Ismail, kind of the populist, Salafist leader who was trying to run for president. It turned out his mother was an American citizen. But with that kind of mobilization behind the Watan Party, they could really create a challenge for the Noor Party. It's way too early to tell. But what's important here is that you're going to have, in all likelihood, I don't think that they're going to come together, you're going to have two Salafist parties fighting each other. It'll be interesting to see just how important it is to have a national organization and social services. Really, it's something that has yet to be tested. Non-Islamists. Okay, well, so you've all been hearing about the boycott of non-Islamist parties behind what's called the NSF, the National Salvation Front. What I found is that the push for the boycott is not really coming from the party leaders themselves, even though they're the ones at the press conference. It's coming from rank-and-file members who feel that they need to overthrow the Brotherhood, and they're looking for actually a new military takeover so they can start the post-Mubarak transition from scratch. That is what they're trying to do. They say it very clearly. They want a new upheaval. The party leaders are naturally more conservative people. I mean, more strategically conservative. And if you ask them in private, they say that they actually don't support a boycott, but they're coming under pressure. So, for example, I was interviewing one non-Islamist party leader. I cannot say his name. And I said, "Why are you boycotting? You know that this hasn't worked in the past." And he said, "Can you please shut off the recorder?" I said, "Okay." He said, "I don't support a boycott. I've been afraid to give an opinion, but I really don't support a boycott. I think we're a party. I think our job is to run." And I said, "But you're a party leader. Why aren't you telling this to your party? Why aren't you leading on this?" He said, "I'm afraid." I said, "What are you afraid of? You're a leader. Leader, get out of the way." And he said that he looked at his hands. It was a bizarre moment in research. He looked at his hands and said, I have a very thin skin. I really can't take the criticism. They're going to say I sold out to the Islamists. I can't do it." And I said, "Well, if you can't do it, you better retire." And he said, "I might do that after the elections." So it was very odd. And what it told me was that the non-Islamist problem is not just that they're deeply divided. You hear that a lot. They're divided between Nasserists, leftists, liberals, socialists, communists, and old regime members. That's part of the problem. Yes, they're deeply divided ideologically, but they also have very weak leaders. And that's really a legacy of the Mubarak regime, trying to keep non-Islamist leaders very, very weak. And it's a legacy that is persisting today, which is why they look to al-Baradei. I asked them, why do you look, I asked the youths, why do you look to al-Baradei? They say, listen, he's the only non-Islamist leader who's not corrupt. But yes, he's inefficient. We have to grow our own. And that's going to take a very, very long time. The Muslim Brotherhood's use of violence is another factor here. It has changed the way the non-Islamists view violence. When the Muslim Brotherhood used violence during the December clashes outside of the presidential palace in Ittihadiyya, the non-Islamists said, listen, and I'm talking here about the activists, not the party activists, we have to send the message that the Brotherhood cannot get away with using violence. The Brotherhood cannot think that it can enforce its will on us, so we will use violence. And the result has been a series of clashes between the Brotherhood and non-Islamists, with non-Islamists increasingly accepting the use of violence. I was interviewing a non-Islamist activist in Suez, and he said that he was at a demonstration outside of Brotherhood headquarters. The Brotherhood threw rocks at him, and they responded by burning the Brotherhood headquarters. And I thought, okay, well, that's not a very proportionate response, but all right, whatever. And then I asked him, kind of out of curiosity, how do you burn a headquarters? Like, how do you do arson? And he said, well, here's what we did. And basically what came out of the discussion is that, in fact, the Brotherhood had not thrown rocks on him. To move the police away from the site, members of his group had thrown rocks down on the police to create a disturbance. Then members of his group from a neighboring building rained Molotov cocktails from the top of this building while he and his friends burned it from the bottom. So, this is not a very liberal approach to politics, to say the least. It's certainly not something that's going to create stability. And I think that you're going to see this kind of violence continue because both the Islamists and the non-Islamists have, in some sense, accepted, if not endorsed, the use of violence as a political tool. And as a result, I think you're going to have ongoing civil strife, although mass revolutionary potential is low. And I say that because, one of the things we forget reading about this in the press is that the kind of person that's really going to burn a headquarter or fight somebody is really like the 0.01%. Most people, even without a strong state, go about their lives, try to go about their lives. And that's why on an ordinary street, Egypt, whether you're in Suez or Cairo or Alexandria or Kafr Sheikh, it feels really normal. I mean, things are just more expensive, but it feels quite normal. But then you have these pockets of clashes that make things very unpleasant and wear down the state. But again, it's not something that is yet mobilizing the masses to demand change. Let me go through policy points of military very quickly. Military is going to, I think, sit this one out. They don't want to get too involved. What they're going to focus on, I think, is building up their own economic interests and try to use those interests maybe to win some public support. This is a clothing store that the military is constructing in Suez. Those are soldiers who are building. Right next to it is a military-owned supermarket that just opened. It's a big supermarket where the stock boys and the cashiers are all enlisted officers. It was a crazy thing. And what was crazy about it was that they were selling goods at below market rates, just like the Islamists do. So I asked the colonel who runs this facility, is this going to be a model to kind of push back on Islamist influence? I didn't get much of an answer, which suggests that he was probably the smartest person I interviewed. U.S. policy points. So Egypt, I think, is not likely to be a major regional player for the time being. Egypt is such a mess domestically. The Brotherhood is going to have to work so hard to just consolidate its power that it's not going to be able to move on very quickly, I think, to its next step of the global Islamic State that's still very much a feature in its rhetoric. And I was asking Saad al-Husseini, the governor of Kafr Sheikh, about this goal of a global Islamic State. He said, listen, it's going to take 10 years to get Egypt right domestically. I mean, we're just not going to be there. It's going to take Morsi 10 years, and by the end of 10 years, Morsi won't be president because there are term limits. We're really focused domestically. Again, I don't think that there aren't events. In other words, I think there are events that could change that. I think a blow-up in the Sinai could force the Brotherhood to kind of move on to its foreign policy aims sooner. But I think at the moment, right now, and this could change, its impulse is to continue trying to consolidate power. It knows that it has not done a good job. As a result, I think the U.S. must force the Muslim Brotherhood to make tough choices that would lead it to moderate its behavior now. We don't want the Brotherhood to continue trying to consolidate its power because the result of that has in fact been greater instability, and we should be using our economic aid as leverage to effect that change. I am not one who supports giving $250 million as a starter without any strings to Egypt. That should all come with a string, because remember, even that relatively small amount of money is symbolic in the sense that it signals to the rest of the international community Egypt is open for business, and our message should be, no, it's open for business when the Brotherhood decides to rule responsibly. Also, and this is reflective of this photo, this is a cartoon of John Kerry as a Muslim brother. There's still this prevalent belief that the U.S. supports the Muslim Brotherhood, was the key force behind Morsi's victory. I do not believe this at all. I mean, I studied how the Brotherhood works. I know that the Brotherhood has every ability to win the elections, but the perception is there, and it's very, very damaging. And it's there because I think we've been far too aggressive in doing outreach to the Brotherhood and really not done enough to reach out to the constituencies who are inclined to be most pro-American, which are the non-Islamists and particularly the Christians. I was with a group of Christians in Alexandria, and they were extremely worried that they were being abandoned by the United States, and the the thinking that we are supporting the Muslim Brotherhood really reinforces that. I did get the sense that the ambassador is trying to roll that back. She's doing what she can to engage Christians more, attending Christian religious services. But I think we need a stronger statement that we are not supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. We support Egypt. We work with who's there, but we have no interest in one particular party. And finally, again, though mass upheaval is unlikely, I think we need to be aware that there's the possibility of triggers. I think the first trigger will come on March 9th. That's when there's a verdict due on the Port Said soccer riots case. I saw graffiti all over Alexandria and Cairo talking about March 9th as a possible day of revolution. Again, do I think that a verdict going one way or the other will actually cause a revolution? No, but I think it could cause a mass upheaval, and it's only a matter of time, I think, before these episodes of upheaval lead to some kind of severe instability. I just don't think that that's now, but again, always look out for possible triggers. Thanks for listening.
Very good. Thank you, Eric. Aaron?
So Tunisia, a country that many people viewed as the beacon for democracy in the region, the place that started everything. Well, the story's a little different 2 years later. I just got back last week after spending 8 days there, talking to a variety of figures along the political spectrum, ex-regime officials, and I even got the chance to meet some jihadists in Ansar al-Sharia. So what's the verdict on the transition 2 years later? Well, Tunisia is currently in a state of stagnation, polarization, fear, and disillusionment. There is some good news, though. It's not nearly as bad as Egypt. The problem is that Tunisia has failed to live up to a lot of lofty expectations that many in the West and Tunisia itself thought would happen after the fall of Ben Ali's regime more than 2 years ago. It's true that Tunisia definitely does still provide the best hope for achieving a consolidated democracy, but there are many old and now new barriers that are making the task that much harder. The call of protesters for economic betterment and job opportunities in December 2010 and January 2011 still remains an important point of contention for Tunisians throughout society and all levels. In addition to these original demands, there is now also an acute political polarization and disillusionment, as well as an ambiguous security policy that has left many Tunisians fearful for their own safety, especially in response to the recent assassination of the secular left figure Shukri Belaid. These are some of the lessons that I learned while I was in Tunisia, and these three areas have provided the cocktail that has led to some of the current sluggishness in Tunisia's transition. On the economic front, last week Moody's once again downgraded Tunisia's economy and has placed the rating for further review, which was coming on the heels of a few weeks ago when the S&P also downgraded their rating. Further, the tourism sector has not completely rebounded, and although I was there during the off-season for tourism, you didn't see that many people around. I spent some time in Sousse in the area called Kantaoui, which is where tourists usually stay in the area, and it was almost like a ghost town. So the gap, and another issue is also the gap between the coastal regions and the interior, which continues to grow and become even more uneven. This is an issue that many don't really discuss. You hear more about the secularists versus the Islamists, but there's also another angle regarding sort of the coastal cities and what's going on in the interior. And one of the groups that has sort of exploited this issue is Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia, which is the group that many believe are responsible for the attack on the U.S. Embassy in Tunis this past September. They've been doing this through usage of social welfare provisions similar to the Muslim Brotherhood, but of course believing in sort of al-Qaeda's globalist type of ideology. Additionally, the business climate for international organizations, according to some American officials I spoke with, is not too welcoming. The economy is too protectionist and does not allow franchises, and as a result has discouraged many international, including American businesses, from investing in the country, which would probably help provide some jobs. Of course, a loan from the IMF would help alleviate some of these problems and start the process of reforming different parts of the economy. At this point, though, due to the instability and uncertainty with the security and the political situation, the IMF in mid-February stated that negotiations were still ongoing about this and, quote, Once the political situation is clarified, we'll assess how best to help Tunisia. So that still has not happened either. The economic recovery has also been hampered by the lack of push for major legislation within the Constituent Assembly. Of course, they're focusing on writing a constitution, but they're also being tasked with providing legislation as well. Many seem to think that the Assembly and Ennahda are plodding along, while everyone acknowledges that the fuel subsidy system is completely broken. The government has been reluctant to reform the system, instead opting for piecemeal types of changes like the recent increase that happened earlier this morning, which hurts everybody's pocketbook and will have ramifications in the future without actually making people feel that real change could happen. The IMF program might help, but it would surely be better if the government hadn't waited 18 months before getting some of these reforms put through. One of the challenges that the Tunisian state will continue to have to reconcile with is the issue related to more college-educated graduates than available jobs. When I spoke with an ex-regime official from the Ben Ali era, he explained that there was a big boom in colleges built in the 1980s, and on average, about 70,000 students started to matriculate and graduate every year, but there are only 30,000 jobs available in the market. So you can see how over time this could build up. And this growth in unemployed educated students with higher expectations led to much of the frustrations that precipitated the December 2010 protests. And I think that this factor will continue to be prevalent going forward. While the economy has been a key issue prior to the revolution, one that has shaken many is the perceived deterioration in the security over the past year or so. When I arrived in Tunisia, it was a week after the assassination of Shukri Belaid, which was the first high-profile assassination in the country's history. So the atmosphere of insecurity still very much permeated, especially for individuals who are on the left. It is sort of the culmination of a kind of insecurity Tunisians have been facing what they believe for a long time post the fall of the regime, in which criminals seem to be above the law and no one is trusted. In some group taxis that I was eavesdropping on people's conversations just to see what the mood of people were and what they're talking about. I know that sounds sort of Tom Friedman-esque, but I actually wasn't talking to these people, so they're personal conversations. But so, I mean, they're talking generally about the worry about the security issues, and some of the youth activists I spoke with also feared that the security would continue to get worse just because Ennahda has been dropping the ball in it. And even when I spoke to some officials in the U.S. Embassy, I mean, they're very disappointed in the response to the attack on the embassy. And they've definitely cooled on Ennahda as potentially, you know, being this great savior of an moderate Islamist party. So one of the main causes of the lack of progress has to do with the security sector reform. It is believed by many that the current Ministry of Interior now contains 3 factions. One is still loyal to Ben Ali. Another one is now loyal to Ennahda, and a third one doesn't really back any individuals. According to Radwan Masmoudi, who's the president of the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy in Tunis, he explained that it was imperative for the Ministry of Interior to be rebuilt, but it needs to be in the confines of respecting human rights and the rule of law, which they're still not doing. There's still a lot of reports of torture. He concluded by saying, quote, "Security is also the first condition for real and sustained economic and political progress, especially in a country where more than 400,000 individuals are involved in the tourism industry." Another contentious issue related to the Ministry of the Interior is that many feel it is victimizing them. Individuals on the left joked, but you could tell they were being serious, that they felt that there was a double standard when there are protests in the street. For instance, when Islamists would go out in the streets and protests, they viewed it as the police protecting the Islamists. But when you had seculars, leftists, liberals, whomever, when they went out to protest, you saw that the police would attack them or be throwing tear gas at them. So they felt that there was this double standard going on there. On the other side of the spectrum, in meetings with guys with Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia, many felt that the Ministry of Interior was illegally breaking into homes and mosques, destroying people's possessions, and unjustly arresting individuals without any charge. Whenever the election is set, the date is still fluid. The security situation will be a major campaign issue, as Sonia Karma, who's a senior leader within the Nida Tunis party, which is one of the main secular opposition parties, noted. She said that this law and order line is shown by the fact that they even created their own affiliated think tank, where they've been putting on conferences within Tunisia and trying to talk with people in the government and try and reach out with organizations in Europe and even in the United States. Whether this law and order approach provides an advantage remains to be seen, since Nida Tunis is still very much a coastal, an urbanite, and elitist movement. Nida Tunis as well as Ennahda are the two biggest parties at this juncture, but both have used toxic language to denigrate the other side, which has really created this major polarization that has been really bubbling up over the past 6 months to a year. On the one hand, you have guys in Nida Tunis or the left calling Islamists rats, and then on the other hand, you have Ennahda calling their opponents kuffar, extremists, and snakes. This polarizing atmosphere has erected this sort of zero-sum game whereby each side believes that one can eliminate the other, when in fact what's going to have to happen is that, as one liberal activist told me who's not affiliated with any of the parties because he just truly was disillusioned, he said that they need to accept the reality of each other, and the only way that true progress can be made on this front is if they realize that one and the other are not going anywhere. So Mahmoud Kamoun, who is the son-in-law of the now former Prime Minister Hamadi Jabali, believes that it is necessary for Ennahda to continue and follow the path of the AKP party in Turkey, instead of veering further to the right, which would be a catastrophe for Tunisia. And he was fearful over it, especially in light of some of the decision-making that happened related to Jabali's talk about the technocratic government, but then his own party rejecting it, and now he's not in office anymore. This rightward drift, which could potentially curtail rights, especially women's rights, is what drives the fears of actors on the left. For Ennahda, many fear in Nida Tunis the revival of the old regime and their attempt to retake the state and once again suppress Islamists. These are definitely legitimate concerns from both sides and characterize some of the reasons why the Constitution has yet to be completed or the next election has yet to be set. It is true that Nida Tunis is not part of the current government coalition or official opposition, but parties within the Constituent Assembly on the left sympathize with Nida Tunis's concerns, and you've seen them sort of picking off some smaller parties and starting to join together in a potential coalition for the future election. Many on both sides of the aisle that I spoke with were unsure about the future prospects if the parties can agree and do not complete the Constitution. This was a major worry from a lot of people. They sort of saw this stagnation happening. They weren't really sure, just because they originally said that the Constitution was supposed to be completed a year after the original election, so that would have been October 2012. And then they said, oh, it's going to be done in March this year, so this month. And now people are talking about, well, maybe it'll be in May, maybe it'll be in June, which then would push back the election until this coming fall in October and November 2013. So there's a lot of things going up in the air on this point. And as both Masmoudi and Kamoun warned, if the democratic project in Tunisia fails, the only solution people will look to is the Sharia option in their mind. In other words, the ascension of puritanical groups like Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia, who have rapidly grown in the past 2 years. Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia's strategy over the past 2 years is to show on a limited scale within their capabilities that they can provide food, medicine, and security to people, in contrast to the machinations and power grabs by political parties and individuals in Tunis. For example, you have weekly, almost daily events now in numerous cities throughout Tunisia where you have individuals in Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia. They're going and they're bringing food, they're bringing clothing, they're getting medicine to people. And after the assassination of Shukri Belaid, they even mobilized their own so-called neighborhood committees where they went out into the streets wielding bats and other types of items, riding on motorcycles, waving the black flag, and saying that they were protecting the people. And this was not just in the interior. You saw this in some of the suburbs in Tunis or some of the neighborhoods in Tunis. So they've been able to really mobilize themselves. And a lot of the official figures about the number of Salafists in Tunisia have only talked about 10,000. When I spoke to some of these guys in Ansar al-Sharia, they were saying that there are truly actually around 90 to 100,000, which still is not a lot. It's only 1% of the population, and they might want to be inflating their numbers too. But it wouldn't be all that surprising since they have been doing a lot of groundwork. And when I spoke to Kamoun, who's affiliated with the Ennahda party, he said that after the election in October 2011, a lot of officials within Ennahda, when they were elected, they moved out of the interior and moved to Tunis. So you have this vacuum being filled, and as we saw the other day in Tunisia, I mean, there was a large demonstration by Salafis in Sidi Bouzid, which is obviously the seat of where the revolution is believed to have started. So as a result of these potential bad scenarios, if the democratic project fails, many feel that there will eventually be a compromise so as to divert such a development, and Tunisia can then move on to the next phase in its transition. Otherwise, the current political impasse and general feelings of instability could become what would be the new normal. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. David?
Thanks.
Hopefully with some better news.
Well, not just better, but I'm going to talk about the most interesting country in the region, which is Morocco. Why is it the most interesting? Because not much is happening there. And that is what's so interesting about it. How is it that this country, a fairly large one, tied for second or third place in terms of population of all the Arab countries with about 33 million people, very poor, 45% illiteracy, 30% at least youth unemployment. How is it that this country has managed to get through the Arab Spring without a major upheaval? And some people are inclined to say that Morocco perhaps offers us a model of how a monarch can lead his country through a gradual process of democratization and avoid the extremes either of repression or of revolution. People like David Ignatius, Fareed Zakaria, and others have popularized this notion, and some people are trying to apply it to other countries in the region, like Jordan, or perhaps even some of the Gulf monarchies, or perhaps even others. After a week in Morocco, and having spent some time studying the issue over the years, and I want to, by the way, offer thanks to my research assistants for planning the trip and for helping me update myself on Morocco, Heba Dafashi and Grace Abu Hamada, I have come to a completely different conclusion. Neither of those views is right. This is not a country that is reforming in some fundamental way so as to avoid revolution, nor is it a country that is ripe for revolution anytime soon. Rather, it is a very special mixture of modest reforms, yet stability. Only modest reforms, yet somehow Morocco is stable and is likely to remain stable. So let me talk briefly about three things. One is, what are these reforms? Two is, why is the country under an Islamist government, at least nominally? Why is it not really moving in an Islamist direction? And three, why do I think that it is likely to remain stable? And are there any lessons for other countries in the region based on the Moroccan special case? Number one, it is true that in 2011, at the start of the Arab Spring, there were quite large demonstrations, several 100,000 people in several major cities in Morocco, protesting against economic grievances and in favor of more political openness, for example, specifically an end to corruption. And it is true that King Mohammed VI offered, in immediate response to these demonstrations, some reforms of the Moroccan political system by, for example, promulgating a new constitution which was approved in a referendum at the end of June of 2011, promulgating a new constitution that took away some of the king's own powers, for example, the power to appoint a prime minister at will, or the designation in the previous Moroccan constitution as sacred, or, at least on paper in this new constitution, control over all of government economic policy. All of those things were a measure of reform that helped to quiet the popular protest and that resulted in November of 2011 in a remarkable development. For the first time in Moroccan history, a true opposition party won the election by a plurality, the Party of Justice and Development, the PJD as it's called, an Islamic party, won a plurality in the election and was, according to the new constitution, given the power to appoint its own leader as prime minister of the Moroccan government. And he is the prime minister of the Moroccan government today, Abdullah Ben Kiran, leader of the PJD. But all of this, in my view, is less than meets the eye. Because in practice, the king and his palace, his coterie, or the makhzan, as it's called in Morocco, control much of political and also of economic life in the country. And the PJD in power is not only a compliant party, but also not really an Islamic party. Instead, the Islamic impulses in Moroccan society have devolved into another, more powerful, more popular, underground, or at least not fully legal movement called Al-Adl wal-Ihsan, justice and charity, as it's usually translated into English. And I will talk in just a moment about what they think. Let me go back to the ways in which, in my view, the king and the palace still control the country. I'm going to give you some examples that I discovered on my trip. I spoke with one of the cabinet ministers in this new PJD, right, so-called Islamic government, who told me that as one of their first steps in response to popular demands and as a way of reducing palace control over life in the country, they had published a list of thousands of individuals who had benefited from corruption and cronyism and nepotism in the past several years. And he was very proud of this as a way of exposing and presumably reducing, or at least controlling, limiting corruption in the country, which everyone knows, and he himself freely admitted was part of the king's and the palace's network of control. But then I asked him, well, that's nice. What happened to those people? And his answer was, well, we prefer, rather than punishing people, we prefer to turn over a new page, to start fresh. In other words, nothing happened to those people. Their corruption was exposed, but they weren't punished for it. And then in a later interview, I found out that not only were those people not punished, but the very same people who appeared on this list of thousands of corrupt individuals are still benefiting from the new page in Moroccan political and economic life. They are still the recipients of economic and political favors from the palace. Another example. Even though, according to the new constitution, the king must appoint as prime minister, as I said, the leader of the party that gets a plurality in free elections, and they are relatively free and competitive elections, still, even according to the letter of the new Moroccan constitution, the king in his person is inviolable and must be respected. It is against the law to criticize the king. And people are actually arrested and sent to jail for doing exactly that. The king still controls the armed forces and the entire security establishment of the country, according to the Constitution. And the king, not according to the letter of the Constitution, but in practice, still controls, by most estimates, about 10 to 20% of the entire Moroccan economy, through a network of palace advisors, and I have their names if you want, based on some of the interviews that I conducted during this trip, and uses that economic control in order to dispense favors and keep political parties compliant with his wishes. And so let me turn to the PJD in power and illustrate how compliant and how not really Islamic at the same time I think it is, even in power. I interviewed one of their cabinet ministers, and he told me that, number one, we are not in government in order to confront the king. And number two, he said, even more surprising to me, we are not in government to Islamize the country, which is already Muslim. That's a verbatim quote from a minister in the cabinet of an Islamic party government in Morocco. And in practice, every time there is an issue, a controversial issue, sometimes involving Islam, sometimes involving corruption, sometimes involving even foreign or security policy, every time there's a controversial issue that pits the position and the platform and the personal attitudes of PJD leaders, even the prime minister himself, against the palace, it's the palace that wins. So that when the PJD tried, for example, as part of its more Islamic orientation, to make primetime news on Moroccan television in Arabic instead of in French, the palace said no. And that was it. The answer was no. When the PJD tried to start Islamizing the educational curriculum in Moroccan schools, the palace said no. And that's how it is. Except that, as one of the cabinet ministers explained to me, instead of concentrating on the curriculum, they're concentrating on improving teachers' salaries and qualifications. In other words, we couldn't do what we were elected to do or what we wanted to do because the palace said no, so we're doing something else instead. When the Minister of Tourism from this Islamic party went to Marrakesh, which is one of the important tourist destinations in Morocco, and which tourism provides about 15% of Morocco's gross domestic product every year. And he berated some of the tourist operators in that interesting and exotic city and said, when I think of Marrakesh, I think of Sin City, because this is where people come to relax Islamic restrictions and drink or gamble or chase women or just have a good time. The tour operators complained to the palace and said, this guy is hurting our business. And he was forced to backtrack immediately. And no new restrictions on any of those tourists, unlike Egypt, for example. No new restrictions have been imposed on the tourist industry, whether it follows Islamic strictures or not. And finally, just to take one more example, when the PJD wanted to reduce the amount of airtime devoted to commercials for gambling in Morocco, the lotto operators and others, the casino operators, complained to the palace, and the palace said, forget it. You can maybe cut back a few commercials a day, but everything is going to stay just the way it is. So if the PJD in power is not really an Islamic party, and is not really even an independent political party in Morocco, where are the Islamists in Morocco going? They're going to El Adl wal Ihsan, which is not a political party, which is not even officially legal, but which is, by most accounts, despite the secrecy that it strives to maintain, an important grassroots movement in Moroccan society with somewhere, and the guesses range from 200,000 to maybe as many as 1 million members. When, for example, the leader of the El Adl wal Ihsan passed away last December, just a couple of months ago, 500,000 people attended his funeral in Morocco. That was Sheikh Abdesalam Yassin. I had the interesting experience of being taken to interview two of the leaders of El Adl wal Ihsan. And this is what they told me. First, I asked them about Islam and democracy. And to my astonishment, actually, right off the bat, these guys said, Islam and democracy are incompatible. I'm going to tell you this right now. From an ideological or a theoretical or a philosophical point of view, Islam and democracy cannot coexist. They contradict each other. Because Islam says that sovereignty belongs to God, and democracy says that sovereignty belongs to the people. But, they said, in practice, we can find ways, when we come to power, of instituting Islam gradually and in accordance with popular wishes as much as possible. So then I said, what about Sharia? Let's talk about that. And he said, my main interlocutor said, yes, Sharia, absolutely. We are going to institute Sharia. But I want to tell you something, David. When you guys think about Sharia, all you think about is cutting off hands and things like that. And I said, no, actually, I know a little bit about it, and I know that that's not all there is to Sharia. But it is true, isn't it, that according to Sharia, that's what you're supposed to do with a thief, is cut off his hands. And he said, yes, that's correct. But according to the true Islam that we will implement, first, you have to create a society that is just, and a society in which people can earn an honest living without resorting to thievery. And only then can you implement Sharia. And even then, you first have to warn the thief, and you have to have witnesses. And only as a very last resort, in just a few cases, will you actually cut off the thief's hand. And then he said, this was the most interesting observation, I think, of all. And then he said, and anyway, why are you concerned with petty thieves when the biggest thief in the country, whether in Morocco or in Saudi Arabia, is the king? And I said, oh, so you want to cut off his hand? And he didn't answer the question. But what he did say was that, call it whatever you want. You can call it a constitutional monarchy if you want, but what we want is a different government. We don't say, bring down the regime. We don't say that. But what we say is, let's create a real revolution in Morocco, not a phony, and these were his words, not a phony PJD, nominally Islamic government, but a real Islamic government in which the king has no power at all. I don't care, he said, if you call it a constitutional monarchy, as long as the king has no power and Islam rules the country, that's when we will be satisfied. So if, in conclusion, if there are several 100,000 people in a poor country like Morocco that is still repressive in many ways, despite its reforms, who subscribe to this clearly revolutionary, fundamentalist, and very well organized and secretive brand of Islam. Does this remind you of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt? Why is it that Morocco is so stable? And why is it likely, in my view at least, to remain stable for the foreseeable future? I think there are a few things to point out here by way of conclusion. One is that although it's impossible to measure or to prove, most people in Morocco, whether Moroccans or smart foreign observers who've been living in Morocco for many years, believe that the king is still personally quite popular. And he has the advantage that some other kings have, like I think the king of Jordan, of being able, by creating a government, by having elections, by instituting a sort of parliamentary democracy, he has the advantage of being able to blame the government for things that go wrong, or things that people don't like, or disappointments that they have. And in Morocco, the king has the further advantage of being able to blame not just the government, but his own entourage for anything that goes wrong, and for people to take out their anger and frustration on the mahsen, on the circle of close advisors that the king has, which he is very good at replacing every couple of years and substituting the inner circle for the outer circle and the outer circle for the inner circle and kicking some people out and bringing new people in and so on. Those are the people that many Moroccans blame for the corruption or the repression or the lack of real Islam in political life and so on, rather than the king himself, to some extent at least. Second, the example of the Arab Spring 2 years later is not such an appealing example. to many people in Morocco. And so I think what you have going on now is a kind of reverse demonstration effect, where before revolutions, or at least popular uprisings, spread from one country to another, when Moroccans today look at what's happening in Tunisia or Egypt or Libya or Syria, they say, we don't want this here. And if the price of stability is stagnation, that's better than civil war. And number three, and I think this is also important, it is true that the Moroccan Makhzen, the palace and the king's advisor, have allowed a measure of reform to take place, which has absorbed some of the popular frustrations and has given people some hope for a better future. And so I would say, in conclusion, is there something that Morocco can teach us about how to do better? Maybe it's too late in Egypt or Tunisia or Syria, but maybe in some other countries, maybe in some other monarchies around the region. Is there something that Morocco can teach us about that? I don't think so. I think that Morocco is a special case. And the special blend of personal popularity that the king has, fear of contagion from its neighbors, and some measure of modest but still not trivial reform is very, very difficult to duplicate anywhere else. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Three very interesting different case studies. Aaron who had to leave a moment ago because he has to do this similar briefing for someone in the State Department. So I have to apologize for his absence in our Q&A session. But I wanted to make one observation and then turn back to our colleagues here. It seems interesting to me when you look at the decisions that the mainstream Islamists in each of these countries are making in terms of their quest for political power. In Egypt, the decision is get it as fast as possible. And we had a constitution writing process which occurred over the span of 48 hours and a ratification in a week, you know, and as fast as you could possibly imagine it. And in contrast, in Tunisia, where the analog would be what is Ennahda doing on the constitution, Aaron told us a moment ago that there it's stretch it out. It's taken a year. It take another, 6 more months. Stretch it out, and we can, if we have to live with political uncertainty, so we live with political uncertainty. And then, if you want to take this analogy even further, in the case that David just mentioned, the mainstream Islamists not only stretch it out, but they're just deferential completely. Although I think if you actually scratch the surface, a lot of them hope that eventually, with the passage of time, power will land on their doorstep. But they don't seem to be eager to do much about claiming it, in contrast to the Egyptian case, where the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is doing everything they can, from your story, Eric, to claim it and concretize it and lock it up as quickly as possible. So the pursuit of power across North Africa is a very different story from, in terms of the Islamists, from one to the next. And then the contrast, of course, is in each of these countries, is there the more radical Islamist alternative, whether it's the Salafists that Eric described as being split in Egypt, the Ansar Sharia of Tunisia that Aaron described, and the Adl wal Ihsan that David described, each of whom operating in their own environment, but each of whom working to pick up whatever pieces they can. So with that observation about power and its discontents, if you will, let's open up a question and answer discussion, and just start by asking you, Eric, if you can just give us your assessment of, since you just were left, I think, or maybe you were overlapping with John Kerry, if you can give us your assessment of regime and opposition vis-a-vis the United States. How do they look at us? What do they expect of us? What do they fear from us, etc.?
I just actually want to just respond to one point that you made about kind of why the Brotherhood moved so quickly to consolidate power as opposed to the other countries. One thing to always keep in mind about the Brotherhood is that its foremost priority is organizational integrity. And so when the revolution happened, it was actually not totally inevitable that the Brotherhood would move very, very quickly to consolidate power. And I say that because there was this debate within the Brotherhood that I was covering at the time, because I was in Egypt at the time, between whether they should move very quickly to form a party or whether they should actually focus on dawah and still trying to Islamize society before they pursue power. And the reason why those who wanted to pursue power now won out is because the fear was that if the Brotherhood didn't immediately take a strong political role, their rank and file would pursue other political alternatives and would hurt the organization's integrity. So that's really why you've seen the Brotherhood move so quickly to pursue power and kind of brush aside those who called for something more gradual, more like what you're seeing in Tunisia and Morocco, because of the fear that this would undermine the organization. Remember, this is a top-down organization, and that's always something to keep in mind when you want to understand the decisions it's going to make. Now, as for the how people in Egypt viewed Kerry's visit, there was a wide range of views. I mean, obviously, the administration has done a very outward job at reaching out to the Muslim Brotherhood, reaching out to the Islamists in general. The administration says that it has good relations there. It's able to get a meeting very, very easily. That's certainly what diplomats in both Cairo and Alexandria tend to say. But there were a number of boycotts of these meetings from the non-Islamists that were pretty well reported. But even within that camp, you had some splits. So you had a meeting in which, if I remember correctly, Anwar Sadat attended. I think Ayman Noor attended a meeting with Secretary Kerry. But on the other hand, many of the youth activists boycotted. The members of the National Salvation Front, including El Baradei and the WAF chair, boycotted. And they kind of used this excuse of, look, the administration is backing the Brotherhood and backing the Brotherhoodization of our government to get out of engagement. I do think that the administration made a mistake here. Secretary Kerry was supposed to meet with youth activists, and in particular the leader of April 6, Ahmed Maher, and then tried to group those activists in a meeting that was more broadly for non-Islamist leaders rather than a separate meeting for the youths. And as a result, those youths pulled out of meeting with the secretary. So I think that if we're going to do youth engagement in Egypt, and I actually think that's very important, particularly among non-Islamist youth, then we have to really make sure that in future trips, the secretary or any other diplomat going out there really sets aside time and doesn't just try to lump them in with all other non-Islamists, because really the outlook of a youth activist is substantially different from that of a party leader.
Let's open the floor for your questions. Ralph, over here on the left.
Two quick questions for David. When you were in Morocco, was there any mention of the situation in the Western Sahara? And second, what was the response of AQIM, the situation in Mali, the whole terror attacks in Algeria?
Yeah. Okay, good. Thanks for the questions. Of course, you can't go to Morocco, you can't talk to a Moroccan official without mention of the Western Sahara. It's part of their routine, I guess, if you want to call it that, part of their sort of standard discourse, which is that Morocco is in control and by rights, and this territory belongs to us, and we're offering it autonomy, and the situation there is not great, but it's much, much better than the Sahrawi people in the camps in Algeria, in Tindouf, and so on and so on. So they do mention it, and they do see that as something that they really genuinely care about and want other countries to recognize. And I think that it's probably the case that when it comes to Morocco's internal political stability, that this nationalist cause is helpful to the government and to the palace as a way of rallying the people around it, even though there's no real threat that they face. I mean, the status quo is very tenable, very sustainable, I think, Moroccan control of the Sahara, Western Sahara. I've seen this in operation in Morocco ever since the first time I visited in 1981, just very shortly after they marched into or a few years after they marched in and took over the Western Sahara. Every time there's some kind of internal crisis, economic protest demonstrations, the king or somebody gets up and says, we have to all be united because we have to keep control of our territory and maintain our historic rights and so on. And it sort of works, amazingly enough. So that's about the Western Sahara. About, what was the other question that you asked about? About AQIM. Okay, there's an amazing thing that's going on here, which is that Morocco, the spillover from Algeria, from Libya, from Mali, from everywhere else in the region has literally not touched Morocco. There was not a single terrorist incident in Morocco in the last year, not one. And in the decade since 2003, when there were a few rather significant bombings in Casablanca, there have been a grand total, and I owe this to Yona Alexander, who's sitting here, who compiled these statistics. There have been a grand total of nine terrorist incidents in Morocco, less than one a year for the last decade on average, compared to almost 1,300 incidents in Algeria, right next door. So when you talk to Moroccans and you say, what is the spillover from AQIM in your country, they rightly and very proudly say zero, or almost zero. And this, too, is a point, I think, in some Moroccan consciousness, I think is a point of caution for them when they think about upsetting the apple cart or, you know, kind of internal social strife or something like that. They worry that they don't want to go the way of their neighbors in Mali or in Algeria or anywhere else in that respect. And what they do want is, and they talk about this quite a lot, is they do want to have more cooperation with their neighbors in confronting this challenge. And of course they blame Algeria in much the way that Algerians blame Morocco for obstructing greater unity and greater cooperation among the countries of the Maghreb.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Lambert from the State Department. I had two questions, one for Eric and one for David. Eric, you had described local sheikhs shifting allegiances from the Noor party to the Watan party. Can you speak a little bit to the factors that are encouraging them to shift that direction? And for David, did you get any sense that the Yassin's death has impacted the Justice and Charity organization, made it weaker? Are there any splits? You know, how does Nadia Yassin, his daughter, kind of figure into that mix? Yeah.
So I should emphasize that it's almost impossible to quantify just how many pro-Noor sheikhs have now shifted to Watan. My sense that shift is happening is a result of the conversations that I was having with people who are local politicians or involved in local political parties in the various places that I was visiting. But the reason why some sheikhs are shifting at all is because of the perception that Yasser Burhami, the dominant sheikh in Al-Dawa al-Salfiya, and therefore the most influential sheikh over the Noor party, is acting, you know, like a dictator. That he's just far too controlling. And one Watan party official told me that he felt Burhami was trying to replicate the Brotherhood's kind of top-down control among the Salafists. So, you know, whether or not that's true, I actually, you know, that'd be fascinating for someone like me. I did a lot of follow-up questions about with Noor party people as to the extent that was happening, and I came up empty. But the takeaway is that basically those sheikhs that are leaving the Noor party to Watan are leaving because they resent Burhami. How, you know, what's the extent of that? It's very hard to know. But we're going to see in the next election, if Watan emerges, I would say that it probably has something to do with what's happening at the local level, not at the national level, because there's just not much nationally attached to the Watan party to begin with.
Just on this, before you go on this, it would seem that a splitting of the Salafists is a Muslim Brotherhood dream.
Absolutely.
And so do you find any shenanigans by the Muslim Brotherhood in exacerbating this split?
Not really. I mean, if anything, the Noor Party has tried to play up its own conflict with the Brotherhood in a very creative way in recent weeks. It's not so much the Brotherhood that's being aggressive; it's more the Noor Party. But you know, when the Noor Party won last year, when the Salafists won last year, and I was asked why is that happening, I compared it to a society in which everyone likes chocolate, but there's only one chocolate ice cream, and so that chocolate ice cream can do well. But you always therefore have to be open to the possibility that other companies will create chocolate ice cream, and therefore the vote will suddenly be split. And that's what you have here. The question is, what kind of chocolate ice cream can the Watan Party manufacture? No?
So that's, well, thank you.
The chocolate ice cream theory of Egyptian politics.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Jennifer. You know, El Adl wal Ihsan is very secretive. And I was lucky that I had the chance to speak at great length with two of their leaders. So that question is not one that they are prepared to talk about. What you know, the death of your leader means. It's still very raw and very sensitive and very uncertain, even I think for them. I would just say this: number one, Abdussalam Yassin was a very charismatic person. I've watched him on video. And, you know, I disagree with him on a lot of things, but he really is very appealing as a personality, grandfatherly, you know, sort of twinkly and persuasive, and they've lost that. And I don't think, however, that this has led to splits in the movement, and it has certainly not led, it can't lead, right away, at least, to the emergence of some very powerful new charismatic leader. They don't have that. And as far as his daughter, it is certainly true that unlike most other fundamentalist movements, women, and in particular his daughter, played a very important role as a spokesperson for the movement for many, many years, and a very good one. In part, that's because, you know, people tell me that this movement, unlike others, does have, or had, under Sheikh Abdussalam, a strong Sufi component, which also carved out a special role for women. And there was a kind of a sisterhood organization that was actually pretty powerful, called Akhawat al-Akhira, which I don't want to get into all of the, you know, obscure theological issues here, but I think, from what I can see, that with Abdussalam Yassin's death, Nadia's star has faded. I mean, she owed it. You can say what you want about, you know, the organization, the Sufi tradition, the special akhawat, auxiliary of the movement, and so on, but I think she owed her position largely to the fact that she was her father's daughter, and I don't see her. You don't hear about her anymore. She has pretty much dropped from view, and I think that's likely to remain the case. They will not tell you much about their internal deliberations and about even how many members they have or anything like that. So I'm guessing, but that's my short answer to your very good question.
Yes, over here, and then Yona, did you want to close with the question? Okay, please.
Bob McBride,
That's fine.
consultant. For Eric, how will the military view the Muslim Brotherhood attempts to restructure the Interior Ministry?
Okay. And Yona, last question, right behind you.
I want to ask a question, both of you, on the refugee challenge. Obviously, everybody's looking now at Syria. But, for example, in Egypt, the refugees from Libya is one example, or the refugees from Mali and elsewhere. It's a great humanitarian issue, but also a security issue. And What are some of your impressions on that?
Okay, gentlemen.
So, you know, the military, I think, is going to be pretty cautious in terms of how the Brotherhood will want to approach the Interior Ministry, in part because the Brotherhood's failure in this would be the kind of thing that would potentially force the military to do something that I'm convinced it really doesn't want to do, which is perhaps try to reassert itself. On the other hand, if any kind of restructuring somehow managed to rebuild that ministry, I assume that would be something that the military is in favor of. But right now, the military is just really trying to not be a player, and that's both in terms of you know, its hesitance to even you know, to do anything politically on one hand, but also even within the Suez Canal cities that it is technically in control of, that Morsi technically asked it to take over, you really don't see a lot of military men on the streets. You see a handful of military officers here and there, which again just suggests to me the military is not interested in re-entering politics. And so I actually would be inclined to think that despite the military's misgivings about any Brotherhood restructuring, the Interior Ministry is likely to focus first and foremost on its own narrow perquisites. As to the question of Libyan refugees, it frankly didn't come up at all in my discussions. I did meet with somebody in the government speaking about weapons flows, but much more along the Gaza border. And there, you know, he was of the opinion, the official that I met with, that much of the weapon flows had stopped. Of course, that's his opinion. But he took the recent months of quiet as evidence of success.
David?
Yeah, thanks. I have to say also the refugee issue didn't come up. I think that Morocco is very intent on securing its borders very tightly, as tightly as it possibly can, and it does that actually quite effectively. Morocco, you know, strangely enough, again, people don't talk much about Morocco, but it has a very, very large military and security and police establishment, very large, by any standard, and they're pretty good. And there are not a whole lot of, I don't believe, refugees or other, like labor migrants, economic migrants from sub-Saharan Africa or other people who are able to cross Morocco's borders from any direction in any large numbers.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. If I can, if I'm hearing this this presentation through the ears of someone about to brief the president before he goes off to the Middle East, it seems to me as though Morocco, check.
Get a king.
Get a king. Tunisia, something to watch, but not on my agenda right now. Egypt, I heard there's a countdown. There's a bit of a race. Will they get their politics in order before their economics goes off the edge? And if their economics goes off the edge, then this is something which is very much on my daily calendar. And so I think that we're going to hear a lot more about that issue in the weeks ahead. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. We'll be reconvening on Thursday to talk about Syria.